Now, it is true, of course, that Muslims have been somewhat marginal figures in American history. But when we completely remove them from the story, or even worse, blame them for their marginalized status in U.S. history, we also marginalize them in the present. So, what would it look like to construct a U.S. history that includes Muslims and analyzes their roles in the American past? That's the story that I want to begin to tell to you this evening. Let's begin before the Civil War. You know I'm a historian, I have to begin before the Civil War. The first significant population of Muslims to arrive on American shores, next slide, thank you, came as slaves, abducted from West Africa in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Muslim slaves such as the 18th century celebrity Joe bin Salman were sometimes literate, fluent in the Arabic language that had been taught to them in West African Muslim schools and seminaries. Next slide. Their writings in both English and Arabic, and this is a facsimile of an actual manuscript found on American soil. Their writings in both English and Arabic are among the most important slave narratives in existence. Because remember, many slaves were illiterate and did not have the chance to record their own stories. They document the history of the United States as a diverse, vibrant, and oppressive slave society in the 1800s. At least 20,000 African-American Muslim slaves gave their labor to the building of the American economy before 1865. Like other West African slaves brought to the Americas, they contributed their religious cultures, their music, art, and agricultural know-how to the building of a multicultural America. They also fought in America's wars. Muslim slaves and freedmen such as Corporal Bampik Muhammad of Virginia served during the American Revolution, and Bilali of Sapelo Island was an overseer who led a group of armed slaves charged with defending the Georgia seacoast during the War of 1812. Muslim soldiers fought for both the United States and the Confederacy during the Civil War. Oh, there we are. All right. Now I could highlight the lives of many of these slaves to demonstrate their importance to U.S. history. But let me tell you about the Muslim slave who visited U.S. President John Quincy Adams at the White House. Next slide. President Adams was not known for his sense of humor, as you can tell by his portrait there. Okay, did we skip Abdurrahman Ibrahima? Now let's take a view of Abdurrahman Ibrahima. There he is. He was born the son of a Muslim notable in Fouta Djallon, located in the contemporary West African nation of Guinea. He became a media sensation, really, a media sensation in the 1800s, and the basis for a full-length film in the 21st century. Let's advertise that film, Charlie. There we go. And I think this film is coming back around to Indianapolis, by the way, and Muslim Alliance of Indiana is going to be sponsoring it. A member of the Fulbe ethnic group, Abdurrahman was educated in both Timbuktu and Jenne, where he learned to read and write in Arabic. In 1788, during a military campaign to extend the territories controlled by his clan, Abdurrahman was captured and sold into slavery. First taken to the West Indies, he was transported to New Orleans, and then up the Mississippi River to Natchez, where he married a Baptist woman, Isabella, and had several children. Now, Abdurrahman achieved fame as a Muslim prince. They called him the Prince. He was a local celebrity until the 1820s, and then he went national, or as we would say, his story went viral. In 1826, he wrote a letter in Arabic to his father requesting help in freeing him. The letter made its way from one of Mississippi's U.S. senators to the U.S. consul in Morocco, and then to Secretary of State Henry Clay. And I think we have a picture of Henry. There he is. The man who never became president. He desperately wanted to be. He tried for decades. But Henry Clay was Secretary of State, and he agreed to help because he thought the release of the prince might better relations with the North African Barbary states against which the United States had fought two wars, one from 1801 to 1805 and another from 1815 to 1816. Clay's assumption that the Muslim prince was North African was partly a result among slaveholders that Muslim slaves, better educated and more quote-unquote civilized than their non-Muslim peers, were from a different ethnic, racial, and religious style. Now, Secretary Clay, he was a slaveholder himself. He offered to transport Abdurrahman back to Africa, but Abdurrahman would not leave without his family. In 1828, he set out on a nationwide fundraising tour, during which he intended to raise the funds necessary to purchase the freedom of his family and buy them passage to Africa. A variety of northern newspapers spun his life story as the tale of a tragic prince who had been wrongly separated from his rightful legacy. You can tell that would be a story that people would like to hear. As the Freedmen's Journal said, quote unquote, here, he was brought up in luxury and Eastern splendor, but for 40 long years compelled to taste the bitter cup of poverty and slavery. The story took American narratives of white captivity in North Africa, such as Royal Tyler's bestseller, The Algerine Captive, and turned them on their head, introducing the tale of a Muslim prince wrongly held in a Christian land. By evoking the Eastern splendor in which the prince had been raised, it also played on Americans' deeply held and increasingly central fantasies about the Muslim Orient as a place of sensual pleasure. And I hope you will buy all those books after we're done here today so that Charlie can afford to hire an IT technician who will be able to project these images of my PowerPoint onto the screen. So please, folks, get those pocketbooks ready, would you? Now, so to finish up Abdurrahman's story, he met some of the most famous people of his time as he was raising all this money. He met President Adams at the White House. He met David Walker, who was the author of The Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, probably the most important black text written in the antebellum era. He met Massachusetts Congressman Edward Everett, who talked even longer before the Gettysburg Address than I'm going to talk today, and whose words have now been forgotten. He met the Tappan Brothers. No, they were not a musical group. He met the Star-Spangled Banner writer Francis Scott Key. This guy was what we would call connected, or in Arabic, he had wasta. And so he was able to raise that money. He became so famous that back home in Mississippi, the partisans of President Adams' political rival, the future President Andrew Jackson, who would beat John Quincy Adams, said that Adams' support for Abdurrahman was evidence that the administration was, quote, actually exciting the slaves to revolt by the same species of arguments which produced the massacres of Saint Domingo, or Haiti. Maybe, is that the same one? No, that's not the same one.
It's a different.
Westminster 2010, I think, is the code I gave it. But that's a good presentation, too. Jackson's supporters attempted to use, I really appreciate these interruptions because usually by this time in the talk about half the audience is asleep, so this actually helps keep people awake. You gotta have commercials. You gotta have commercials. So Jackson's supporters attempted to use Adams' sympathy for the slave, that, Adams was anti-slavery. And he cited the Haitian Revolution as an example of what could happen when slaves got their freedom. Now, for African Americans such as David Walker, the Haitian Revolution was a sign of a coming American apocalypse in which former slaves would take divine revenge on their captors. So for Southern whites, the potential for a black revolution in the United States was a constant fear and thus a potent factor in political life. Abdurrahman may have become a political liability in the South, but up north, he was a big hit. He was able to raise that money, and in 1829 he departed with his wife Isabella from Norfolk, Virginia for Liberia, the American colony in West Africa populated by African American freedmen and women. Some of his children arrived in Liberia in 1830, while others stayed in the United States. Now, so what? The very marginality of Abdurrahman's story to the main plot of American history, and this is not a man who 20 years ago was in anyone's American history textbook, but it is his very marginality that unveils the centers of power, of economic power, of political power, of cultural power in the United States during the antebellum era. Writing in Arabic on demand, Abdurrahman used his advanced education to set himself apart from other slaves and cultivate relationships with powerful people. Telling the story of his royal lineage, he separated himself from other people of African descent. He made his appeal for freedom safely distant from a more Republican, egalitarian appeal for black liberty. To put it a bit too simplistically, Abdurrahman seemed to be saying that the reason he deserved to be free was not because all people deserved to be free, but because he was special and different. By emphasizing his connections to Islam, he also created a racial, religious, and cultural identity that safely affirmed notions of black inferiority. He wasn't black, he was saying, he was Muslim. His white and sometimes his black audiences did not see Islam as an African religion. For them, it signified the Muslim Orient and a level of civilization that black Africans did not possess. Abdurrahman also gave support to a burgeoning consensus among whites in the North that slavery was a threat to the American way of life. His appeal to white citizens in the United States to help him return to Africa reified the notion that blacks were a foreign element in a white republic.